They say shadows tell the truth more often than faces do. A shadow is the slow confession of light and shape. It keeps the outline of what you are even when you try to hide. This valley, where lanes cut between hedgerows and simple houses pressed close to one another like pages in a book, people took notice when a shadow began to walk a little differently from the child who cast it. The child's name was Anwen. She was 7 summers at the time, small enough to fold under a cloak, old enough to know the names of a dozen laneside herbs and how to tie a knot that would not slip. Anwen's hair was the dark of wet chestnut, and her hands had the quickness of someone used to helping, gathering kindling, carrying a loaf, tucking a mother's cloak. She was not especially brave or foolish. She was simply present in the way many children are, attentive to what adults do not see, patient with small mysteries, ready to be delighted. It began on an evening in late harvest, when the light at the end of day sat low and long and the world seemed to stretch a little thinner between labor and rest. Anwen had been sent to fetch a candle from the church. Her pockets were stitched by her mother's careful hand. Her shoes were scuffed in the way honest shoes should be. She took the lane she always took, the lane with the leaning sycamore, the lane that smelled of thyme and cattle. At first, no one noticed anything odd. Shadows were long in that hour. Lamplight from cottages bled into the dusk. The lane became a watercolor of shapes. Anwen walked, the small bell of the church thin on the air. Moved ahead of her. It did not lag or hesitate. It stepped clear of her feet by the length of a measure and kept going, walking as if it had learned the route earlier than she had. Not the outline of panic or a wild leap, just a calm, deliberate pace. The first person to tell the story was old Thomas, who was mending nets by the road and had the habit of noticing simple things. He watched Anwen's shadow cross the lane and step forward. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and told the innkeeper, and the innkeeper told 2 others over her hearth. People shrugged. Thomas was a man who spun tales like twine, but there was no flourish in his voice that night, only the small tremor of surprise. Anwen, for her part, felt nothing at first. Children often do not notice the oddness of things until someone points it out. She continued toward the church and back as the service's final prayers drifted away. When she reached the cottage door, she found her mother waiting and the dog curled and blinking in the low light. Her mother smiled and pulled Anwen's cloak up tight. It was the next morning that the household realized the pattern. When Anwen went out to gather water at dawn, the shadow ran to the well before she arrived, waiting there as if it had gone ahead to fetch a pail. She laughed when she saw it, light and a little startled, and the dog barked once, as if in recognition. For a few days, the odd thing was charming. The shadow seemed to be in a hurry sometimes and slow at others. It traced a pattern of behavior that might be described as helpful. Neighbors joked that the child had a good shadow to run errands. Then the shadow began to learn. At first, it only ran on the lane where light and dirt made its path clear. After a fortnight, it slipped through doorways where no light fell and paused at corners where important choices were made. It waited at the mill when the miller had a complaint. It peered around the side of the baker's oven when bread was stubbornly dense. It hovered at the parish gate when someone had to decide whether to visit a sick relative. When Anwen came near, her shadow would be there already, gently bent forward as if to make the way easier. Rumors multiplied. Some people said the child was blessed. Others said she had a touch of witchcraft. A few kept quiet, believing that ordinary people are better off tending to what they can touch and leaving the rest to the sky. The priest, a patient man with ink on his fingers, observed and made notes in a book. He walked the parish at dusk and found the shadow waiting for him at the stile where it always waited at the hour. A worried wife came to ask for bread. He did not leap to judgment. He simply lit an extra candle in the chapel and said a longer prayer that night. The shadow was not malicious. It did not throw stones or steal from cupboards. Mostly it anticipated when a cart was going to break a wheel at the worst possible moment, the shadow stood near the axle for a day and a half until someone remembered to oil it. When a child was about to fall from a low wall, the shadow's quick motion distracted attention away and a poor decision was avoided. People began to speak of small wrongs being averted by an uncanny nudge, and they began to adjust their lives in tiny ways. A rope was tied more carefully, a supper shared a little earlier, a question asked that otherwise would have been swallowed by pride. Anwen herself grew used to it. She would point and laugh and sometimes scold the shadow as if scolding a puppy. "Stop dawdling," she would say, and the shadow would obediently slow as if embarrassed. But in the quiet moments when she was alone on the lane or sitting on a wall humming to herself, she would find the shadow already there, patient and still, and she felt less alone in a world of grown-up tasks. Not everyone welcomed this change. The smith, a man whose hands were always busy and who valued clear cause and effect, began to grumble. "There's no such thing as a free hand in the world," he muttered. If its wheel not save a cart's, he claimed it made people slack. He argued that skill and industry should be the things that save a cart's wheel, not some. The even stranger moments began existent. The even stranger moments began when the shadow started to act with memory, when it remembered details Anwen had not yet noticed. One dawn, the child stopped to peer under a hedge and found a small ring in the brambles. The ring was plain, not costly, and the inscription inside had letters nearly rubbed away. She called the shadow, and it danced ahead, stopping at a patched coat on a peg in the parish hall. Later that day, an old woman burst into tears when the ring was returned. It had belonged to her sister, who had left long ago. She clasped Anwen's hands and pressed a blessing into them, thanking a child and a stories he could not explain. As stories multiplied, the village's questions shifted from wonder into wary ethics. If a shadow returns a lost thing, is the shadow returns a lost thing? Is the Eurie's returns a lost thing? Is the finder indebted to a child who bears it? If a shadow nudges someone away from shame, is it right to say the person has been spared responsibility? The priest urged moderation. Kindness is good, but people must still do the work of repenting and making amends. The smith wanted rules. The innkeeper wanted grateful folk. Who would remember a tavern bill paid? The world cared for itself by combined means, prayer, toil, and, perhaps now, a peculiar shadow. One evening, a traveler came through who had seen wonders and scowled at them in the same breath. He watched the shadow cross the lane ahead of Anwen, and he followed it with his gaze until it paused at the low door of a widow's house. The traveler watched as the door opened. Inside was a dying man who had refused help for weeks, there for the better part of an hour. The traveler left the village with the weight of a question he could not shake. Did the shadow know better than the living, or was it merely a mirror that held up what folk had refused to see? Not all mirrors are gentle. One fog-thick night, the shadow ran away from Anwen, not ahead, not helpful, but away. It followed a dark figure along the ford and into the curve of the riverbank where mischief is sometimes born. Anwen chased after it barefoot, splashing gurgling water and singing a careless song. At the river she saw a figure slip, a child from a neighboring village who had stolen an apple and panicked. The shadow stood at the edge of the water and, as if in reproach, pointed with a long, thin appendage toward the bank where the child could climb rather than drown. Anwen reached and hauled the frightened boy out. It was then that people began to see the shadow as more than a helper. It had a judgment in its motions, knows whom to nudge and when. It forgave with silence and reproved with a long look in the dark. Some villagers decided it was a blessing, others that blessings wearing no badge can be dangerous. Joran the miller, whose mill had been saved by a mysterious nudge a month earlier, prepared a small wooden box and left it by the shrine for offerings, part thanks, part trial. People dropped in coins and pieces of cloth and notes of gratitude. The shadow paid no heed to the box. It continued its work. Anwen grew taller. Seasons moved as seasons do. She learned to bake and to sew, and her laughter changed in the ways of children becoming women. Throughout, the shadow remained her quiet companion, running ahead of errands, sitting patient in winter nights, pressing the small weight of its presence into her days. She began to understand that the shadow's choosing was not random. It bent toward a type of small mercy, a saved child, a repaired wheel, a paid debt restored. One year, a sickness moved through the hamlet's coughs that rattled thin bodies and left doors quiet. The village closed ranks. Windows were shuttered and food passed over porches to those who could not leave bed. In that season, the shadow's activity grew quieter but more urgent. It lingered at doorways of the ill, where it would stand for an hour or two, then move on. It did not cure, but often provided something like the hush of a bedside where one was not alone. Families patted pillows and passed broth. The priest, who had once only noted the shadow in his book, now found himself humming a prayer at the places where it paused. Not long after the worst of the sickness waned, Anwen fell ill herself. It was not the worst of the fevers. It left her frail and quiet, but not defeated. The shadow did what it had always done. It waited at the foot of her bed and sometimes stretched across the floor toward the door as if to meet another presence. Neighbors brought water and willow tea. The innkeeper's wife sat and sang the old. The priest administered small sacraments. On the day her breathing steadied, a woman who had been angry at the loss of a barn door came and laid a small braided band of wool at Anwen's pillow, an apology for a long-ago slight. The shadow shimmered and folded itself over that band as if smoothing it. When Anwen finally rose and stepped out into the lane, the shadow led as always, but now with a steadier, softer step. People greeted her with a new tenderness. They had watched a child fall ill and understood how fine and fragile the ordinary can be. They had also watched a shadow that ran ahead, which made them think about other things that run before us: conscience, memory, the small sense that leads a hand to give rather than take. The village changed in small ways that would be hard for a ledger to name. Men left a bar of bread on a widow's step without being asked. Watchmen checked the ropes on mills with an added care. Years later, grown accustomed to the slow demands of time, it had never harmed anyone. It had, at odd moments, rescued a child, returned a ring, steadied a cart. In the telling, it grew gentler, the marvel turning into a habit of goodness, a town custom rather than a wonder to be tracked by travelers. If you walk the lane now, and the sun falls just right, you might see the long shape of a shadow step ahead of a small figure. It will not shout or demand. It will not make you poorer for its help. It will suggest, with the lightness of an old hand, that sometimes what leads us is not only what we own, but what chooses quietly to care. The question the villagers returned to most often was simple: who tended the tender things in the world? The stitched hems, the small debts, the children who forget not to be brave? Sometimes the answer came as an old woman's smile, sometimes as a priest's folded hands, sometimes as a child's rough mitten. Once in a while,